Hey guys, welcome to a new monthly series I'll be doing here on the Needs to Hone Magic channel in addition to my other monthly series. This one is, I guess, really the only series that isn't just like gameplay, and in this one I'll be doing a top 10 list every month that's sort of topical. Sometimes I'll be sort of more serious about metagames and stuff. Sometimes I'll probably be a little goofier, just depending on what's going on in the Magic community. But this one's going to be a little more serious. It is, as you can see, the top 10 cards that are good against Eldrazi in Modern. And what I mean by that are cards that are better in this Eldrazi-dominated metagame. If you don't know, Eldrazi decks were 6 of the top 8 cards at Pro Tour Oath of the Gatewatch, and they now make up about 20% of the Magic Online metagame, both of which are kind of disgusting. The deck is generally broken, and basically the only way to combat it effectively now is either to play Affinity, which is, equally fast and can get under it, believe it or not, at times, and then over it, I guess, with flyers, or to make sure you're running cards that match up well with Eldrazi problems, and that's what this video will be about. First, I'll talk about the culprits. It's important to mention that there are several different versions of the Eldrazi deck. Some are colorless, some are blue-red, some are mono-black. But these 4 cards are what they all have in common, along with Eldrazi Mimic, actually. But he's, while good, not quite as frightening as these cards. But so these are the cards that this video is going to focus the most on trying to deal with. And I will also mention some other cards that are not like these primary culprits, because the sort of splash damage you get from affecting other cards in the deck makes certain cards, sideboard cards, even better, or mainboard cards. But anyway, Thought-Knot's here, one of the best creatures they've printed in a long time. It's Vendilion Click on steroids. You get to exile a card your opponent has. It does have the downside of when it dies, your opponent draws a card, but it's a random card. They never get back the card you exiled, unlike most of them. So he gets a lot of value because you can get rid of some big problem card, and he's also a good body. Reality Smasher, it's kind of this somewhat similar. Thought-Knot Seer is even better, but it's a 5-mana 5/5 trample haste, and you can always get 2 for 1 if you try to kill it, basically. So that makes it hard for it to kill, in addition to having a massive body. But the card that makes both of these so good cards are Eye of Ugin and Eldrazi Temple, which, if you have both in play, is enough to cast Thought-Knot Seer on turn 2, which is just wrong. Seems wrong. But anyway, Reality Smasher also can be cast much earlier. Thought-Knot Seer and Reality Smasher are both so powerful because they're super efficiently costed spells that also happen to disrupt your opponent in one way or another. Thought-Knot Seer gets rid of your opponent's best card, and Reality Smasher makes you get 2 for 1. So those are problems. And so we'll go ahead and move on to my top 10 list of cards I think are better in this Eldrazi metagame than they were before, and cards that I think can fight with the Eldrazi pretty well. For number 10, I kind of have 3 cards. I have a few numbers on here that are a number of cards, but they're there for related reasons. These 3 creatures are all creatures that, if you have to discard a card, come into play. If your opponent makes you discard it, this means you no longer get 2 for 1 if you say Path to Exile or Reality Smasher. Now you kill it, and you get to put your Baloth or Smiter or Wiltleaf Legion play. I do think a green-white X kind of aggro deck could be pretty good right now, because of these 3 creatures especially, who are all already really efficiently costed, powerful cards, and they're even better in this metagame now that you have your opponents playing Eldrazi. It's also good against Liliana, for what that's worth, kind of splash damage type thing, where you're really trying to stop the Eldrazi, but if your opponent happens to have Liliana, these cards are pretty gross too. At number 9, I have Torpor Orb. I like this card a lot. It hasn't been in sideboards for a while, but I'm betting it starts to show up again. It turns off enter the battlefield abilities. This means it turns off Thought-Knot Seer, which is pretty important. You can get this in play before Thought-Knot Seer. And it also turns off, it's definitely a better sideboard card against the blue-red variety of the deck, where they also run Drowner of Hope and Eldrazi Sky Spawner, and all the cards that process things. It turns all of those off. It's not as good against like the pure colorless decks. It really just turns off the Seer. This is better as a sideboard card against the more colored varieties with all of the processors and Eldrazi triggers and stuff like that, and it turns them off. Thought-Knot Seer is obviously the best thing to turn off, but Torpor Orb is pretty good even without that. So one of the weaknesses of the Eldrazi deck is that it runs very, very little removal. It runs about 2 Dismembers main board most of the time, and this means certain creatures are more valuable than they've been in the past. Hornet Nest is just a good card in general. It had a good time when it was in Standard until it rotated out recently. And I think it's actually a pretty good, at worst, sideboard card for any decks with green in them in Modern because it's pretty good against the Eldrazi. It's not amazing against Reality Smasher, I mean, because they can assign only 2 damage to it, and then you only get 2 insects with Death Touch, but that still means you can deal with their creatures. And chances are, I mean, anything that gives you card advantage against Eldrazi is a big problem for them because they tend to just like spit out their whole hand and try to win that way. But as soon as you're slowing them down with the Hornet Nest, that then makes guys with Death Touch who can just kill their guys, Reality Smasher or not. Granted, you'll take some trample damage. It's pretty good. So I think Hornet Nest, I mean, the ideal scenario is like blocking a Thought-Knot Seer and getting 4 of them, you know, but even just getting 2 is pretty great. The kind of card advantage this gives you, and it's hard to deal with for these Eldrazi decks that A, use up their cards really quickly, and B, run very little removal. So at number 7, I have Painter's Servant. This is kind of an interesting one. You know, there's sort of a tier, I don't know, 4 or 5 combo deck with Millstone and Painter's Servant where you just mill their whole library, and that's pretty cool. You can also do some other interesting combos with Painter's Servant, of course. But I think I could see this card ending up as a one-of in any deck with Court of Calling in it, decks like that, because when you play it and you choose a color, by choosing a color, you're making the colorless version, the colorless Eldrazi, no longer colorless. They gain a color, and that means that those 2 lands, Eye of Ugin and Eldrazi Temple, no longer work for them. So you're sort of blanking those 2 lands. This one is better against the all-colorless version of the deck because, oh no, never mind. It actually works against all of them because even though they cost colored mana, so it's good against all of them. It's even good against Drowner of Hope and things like that. So Painter's Servant just shuts down those lands. Not a bad thing to be able to chord for or search for in one way or another as a one-of, and a pretty good sideboard card, I think. At number 6, I have 2 cards again. They're both cards that increase costs for your opponent to attack you. This is a problem for these decks because Eye of Ugin and Eldrazi Temple, Eye of Ugin technically produces no mana, and Eldrazi Temple can only produce mana for colorless things. So those 2 lands are basically useless for paying these costs, meaning that at worst they're not going to be able to slam into you really hard, and they're not going to be able to develop their board because lots of times you'll play these decks and they just can't pay this cost. Or if they can, it means they're not playing another creature that turn, things like that. I think the Prison is better than the Muse just because it's harder to deal with for the deck. They don't have any enchantment removal. They do at least run Dismember most of the time, so Windborne Muse would be toast there, I think. But both of these cards are interesting. Any sort of card that increases costs or asks your opponent to pay costs is very good against this deck, which brings me to number 5, which are counterspells like Mana Leak and Condescend. Remand is decidedly worse in this current metagame. I mean, it's still okay, but, the feeling of remanding a Drowner of Hope that they tapped, 1 land for or 2 lands for, and they can just play it again isn't so good. But for the same reason that, prison effects, Ghostly Prison and such are good, makes these good as well. They have lands that just can't pay these costs. Mana Leak, even on turn 5 or 6 against a deck like this, like a lot of the time they just can't pay the cost. And Condescend's the same, except it at least scales up a little more and it lets you scry. I like both of them right now in the metagame. I think I would run more copies of Mana Leak than I would Remand right now in this metagame. So that's definitely a shift away from how it would usually be. So at number 4, we have Magus of the Tabernacle, kind of an obscure card, but again, a card that makes your opponents pay extra costs, and it's not extra costs. They can use their fancy lands to play. If they have several creatures in play, which the versions that run processors usually do because they get tons of 1/1 Scion tokens, then they're, in pretty big trouble. The Magus causes a lot of problems. And in addition to that, it can't even die against the Eldrazi deck. Dismember is the only removal they run as of now, and Dismember can't kill a Magus unless you block with it. I would advise blocking against it if your opponent has any mana up at all. So the Magus, I think, is quite good in this strange current metagame. Number 3, we have good land destruction, and by good land destruction, I mean Molten Rain and Crumble to Dust. I think Molten Rain, I mean, blowing up their non-basics is good. Molten Rain, what makes it better than like Stone Rain is that at least it gets you in for some damage, so it does a little bit of action while blowing up their really good land. Crumble to Dust gets rid of all copies of a land. Worth noting, both of these also quite good against Tron, which is a relevant deck in the format. And they're not bad against Affinity, who likes to run Inkmoth Nexus, and getting rid of those can often be pretty devastating. So these two cards, a lot better than they used to be. I could see most red decks mainboarding at least a couple Molten Rains and sideboarding a few more. And Crumble to Dust is already a good sideboard card, but it just got better with another deck being all about fast mana lands. So at number 2, I have Blood Moon, sort of the same idea as before. Turns all their non-basics into mountains, which does mean they can at least tap them for mana, but it also turns off all the benefits that Eye of Ugin and Eldrazi Temple give, and that's pretty sweet. It also makes it so, I mean, they can't cast their creatures that have required colorless, such as Thought-Knot Seer and Reality Smasher, or Matter Reshaper for that matter. It's a card I didn't mention earlier, but is quite good and shows up in this matchup, but it's not like unbeatable or anything. But so Blood Moon, pretty good. Already a sideboard card, going to be more prevalent. There's already a deck called Blue Moon running around that's mainboarding these, and I can see why. So Blood Moon, very good. Very expensive too, unfortunately. And at number 1, I have Ensnaring Bridge. It's a card that this deck just can't deal with in any way. They don't usually, even in their sideboard, they don't have artifact destruction. I mean, the metagame just wasn't ready for this deck when it came out. And it is definitely a problematic deck because the whole format has to warp around it, which is basically what this video is about. But if people had Ensnaring Bridges, and some did, they would have been much better off against the Eldrazi deck. They just can't do anything about it. They can't remove your bridge. They just can't attack. I mean, maybe they can with some Scions, but you can just prison them out. Sort of the message here is that prison decks right now are pretty good, especially if you go like red, white, green, so you can run some of the other cards that benefit, like the number 10 I had Obstinate Baloth and stuff like that, and Guiltleaf Liege and things. Those are all, you could definitely make a deck basically with several of these cards, make sort of a prison deck, and just kill your opponent. That also means, and just incidentally, that the Lantern of Insight decks in general are a lot better than they already were, so that's worth remembering as well. Anyway, that's my top 10 for February of 2016. I'll have another one for you in March. Let me know what you think of my rankings. Think I left a card out. Think I have cards on here that shouldn't be there. That kind of discussion will help us all find a way to deal with this Eldrazi menace. Anyway, thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.